熊本学園大学の中地教授らとともに、血液検査を、住民の方の血液検査を実施をし、日本の平均的な、日本国民の平均的な値よりも数倍、あるいは代替物質の PFAS に至っては数十倍高いということが分かりました。そこで、環境省および東京都に対して、もっと大規模に多摩地域の住民の方々の血液検査、健康調査をしてほしいという提言を提出しましたけれども、両者ともに法律がないので、国がやるべきだ、あるいは東京都を通り越しては国はできないと言ってですね、どちらも着手しようとしておりません。そういうことから私どもとしては、こういった問題、子どもの発達に影響を与える有害化学物質をできるだけ低減していくという、こういう課題に取り組むためには、法的な根拠のある、制度を作らなければ、バイオモニタリング、あるいは健康調査、あるいは子どもに対する配慮、あるいは化学物質の影響を受けやすい人々に対する配慮、汚染地域対策といったものを盛り込んだ法律を作らなければならないということになりました。その法案の説明については、後半にいたしますが、その前に、本日はアメリカではバイオモニタリングというのはもうすでに導入をされて行われているんですけれども、有機フッ素問題について、このバイオモニタリング制度等を活用してですね、さまざまな汚染地域での対策とかに取り組んでおられる NGO、エンバイロメンタルワーキンググループの専門家でありますターシャ・ストイバー博士をお招きして、アメリカでの取り組みについて、具体的な取り組みについてのお話を伺います。きっと私たちに大変参考になるのではないかと考えております。全体で2時間30分という大変長丁場なんですけれども、どうぞ最後までお聞きくださいますようお願い申し上げます。どうもありがとうございます。
はい、では早速講演会を開催したいと思いますが、その前に皆様にいくつか注意事項がありますのでご説明させていただきます。はい、講演資料はこれからチャットに今表示されておりますチャットの方から、チャットに表示されている URL の方からダウンロードをしてください。こちらの資料の無断転用はお控えいただけますようお願いいたします。本日はまず、EWG の方のお話がありまして、その後、沖縄の河村さんからご報告、沖縄の状況について少しご報告をいただいた後、5分間休憩を取り、その後、環境安全基本法の署名の趣旨と、の内容と、趣旨についてご説明いたします。その後、皆様の意見交換等の時間を設けさせていただく予定となっております。今日の講演の動画は今後国民会議のホームページにアップする予定です。本日の講演の録画、スクリーンショットなどの撮影は固くお断りいたします。講演後に質疑応答の時間は設けますが、もしご質問がある場合には、ウェビナー画面の Q&A からお送りいただくということでも大丈夫です。すべての質問にお答えすることは時間の都合上できない可能性があることをご了承ください。最後に、ウェビナー終了後にアンケートが表示されますので、今後の講演会の改善のため、どうぞご協力をいただけますようお願い申し上げます。では、早速ですが、講演会を開始いたします。
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to present to your organization. I'm excited to share our work, and I hope this webinar can be informative. The Environmental Working Group is a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., and we also have offices in California, and that is where I am based. And in the next few slides, I'll talk about a brief introduction to the history and motivation of our work on PFAS. So our organization has been working on the PFAS problem for more than 20 years. And it's unfortunate that we are actually still working on this problem. Our first report documented a highly contaminated community in West Virginia, in Parkersburg, West Virginia in the United States, where the industry DuPont had been dumping chemicals in the community for decades, and they hid the pollution. They knew just how harmful the chemicals were, but they kept it from the community. And that was one of the first reports where we exposed this problem in a highly contaminated community. And more than 20 years ago, we also recommended that not only PFOA and PFAS be nominated for our federal biomonitoring program, but also the whole class of PFAS, because we were very concerned about their health effects and the bioaccumulation in the human body. And also nearly 20 years ago, we also published a groundbreaking report that documented just how widespread these chemicals were in all of the products that we used, including products labeled Teflon, Scotchgard, and Gore-Tex. And we also highlighted just how readily that these chemicals accumulated in the human body. So testing by many government agencies, including EWG, has documented pollution across the country. And this is a snapshot of an EWG developed map that shows the extent of the contamination. And I will talk in more detail later about the testing that our organization conducted. So I'm sure everyone participating on this call is very familiar with per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. And here I'm just showing one of the most common structures of PFAS, PFOA, or C8 for the 8-carbon structured chain. And of course, everyone's familiar with how strong the carbon and fluorine bonds are, and that this makes the chemicals very persistent in the environment. They don't really break down, and that's why they're known as forever chemicals. And of course, we're not just concerned about just PFOA, but we're concerned about the whole class that includes thousands of these chemicals. So our organization is very focused on children's health and chemicals that affect children's health. And in a study that we conducted about 15 years ago, we looked at the cord blood of newborn babies and found that babies are born with about 200 chemicals already in their bodies, and this includes PFAS. And I think this was mentioned previously too. We are concerned about this because PFAS can have developmental and reproductive harms, and that's why we are quite concerned about PFAS affecting children's health and also for reproduction. And some of these reproductive health effects we have reviewed in a report I have linked at the bottom on this slide. Some of these health effects on reproduction include low birth rate, low birth weight, thyroid disruption, harm to the male reproductive system, pregnancy-induced high blood pressure, reduced time of breastfeeding and impacts on mammary gland development, and also increased time to pregnancy or decreased fertility. And for the rest of the presentation, I'll go into more details about talking about the health effects linked to PFAS, some of the more work that we have done on mapping the contamination in the United States, our own drinking water testing that we conducted, and also some of the regulations and policies that we support, as well as individual actions that people can take to deal with the PFAS crisis. And to give a little bit more background on the history, another project that we have done that the link is here is we've constructed a PFAS timeline from internal industry documents that shows, after reviewing them, just how much the companies knew about how harmful the chemicals were and how they hid that information. So as far back as the 1950s, the industry's own studies showed that PFAS was building up in tests in animals. And they also conducted other tests that showed that PFAS were quite toxic. And as far back as the 1970s, when doctors were finding organic fluorine in human blood, they asked the industry about their chemicals as they suspected that it was possibly these PFAS chemicals that were turning up in people's blood. And they used the same false claims back then that they do now, claiming that the chemicals aren't harmful. And they knew also, as far back as the 80s, that these chemicals were linked to harms to the immune system, as well as also linked to cancer in workers in the industry. So going into a little bit more detail and talking about the first report that I mentioned about the highly contaminated community, this was back in Parkersburg, West Virginia. I'll pause here for the interpreter. So from internal tests that DuPont had conducted, they knew that the drinking water in the area was contaminated from the time as far back as the 80s. They knew it was contaminated for decades, but they didn't tell the residents, they didn't tell the area water utilities, and they also did not tell the EPA, but they had dumped millions of pounds of this PFOA into the community from their manufacturing facility that made Teflon. And so when the residents began to connect health problems and diseases that began to become apparent in the community, they connected this to the high rates of disease in the community. They connected this to the chemicals that were being produced in the area, and they filed a class action lawsuit. And so this case was very unique because as a result of it, as a result of the settlement, the chemical industry, DuPont, had to pay out a settlement to the community because they were found at fault. They had to agree to clean up the drinking water. But what was also unique is that the community agreed to use the settlement money to set up a science panel to study the link of PFOA to diseases in the community. And this was called the C8 Science Panel. So again, this was a very unique situation in that the community agreed to use the settlement money to pay for this. And nearly everyone involved in the class action lawsuit participated in the health study. About 70,000 residents gave blood samples as well as health data to be used in this biomonitoring study to further study the links to disease. So they initially thought that it would only take a year or two to conduct the study, but it ended up taking much longer. And after about 6 years of study, they did find probable links of 6 different types of diseases to PFOA exposure. And those included pregnancy-induced high blood pressure, testicular cancer, kidney cancer, thyroid disease, ulcerative colitis, and high cholesterol. And so there were dozens of published papers that resulted from this biomonitoring data set that was collected. And this was a very important study that related these health harms to the exposure to PFOA. And so this court case and this community was the inspiration for the movie Dark Waters. So this was not only a good movie and an entertaining movie, but it was also a really good educational tool to help spread the word to people about how harmful PFAS are. And so I mentioned how the C8 panel found those connections to PFOA exposure to those 6 diseases. And so another important report to note is the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or the ATSDR, published their final toxicological profile, not on just one PFAS, but on 12 different types of PFAS, and they found very similar health harms related to this group of different PFAS chemicals, including some of the same health harms that were previously noted and some additional ones, increased risk of cancer, liver damage, decreased effects on the immune system, including decreased antibody response to vaccines. And some of the similar health harms, as noted before, were found for additional PFAS, including increased cholesterol, thyroid disease, pregnancy-induced high blood pressure, as well as additional health harms, including decreased fertility and low birth weight, should be noted for all of these different PFAS chemicals. And so we know that PFAS chemicals are virtually in the blood of nearly everyone on the globe. Biomonitoring studies conducted by the CDC, or the program is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which looks at a sampling of the general population in the United States. In looking at that data, PFAS have been detected in nearly everyone that was tested, and you'll see some of those frequency of detections here. And so this general population data is useful to compare to different studies and communities. As you can see in this graph here, if you compare the NHANES data or the general population data compared to those that work in the industry, the workers' blood, PFOA in the workers' blood is quite a bit higher, as well as those that are living in known contaminated areas. And another example of a highly exposed community is a community in northern Alabama where there was a 3M production facility, and they actually notified the EPA about some unintentional releases to the environment. And so the EPA asked for an additional exposure investigation in that area. And they did find elevated levels of PFOA and PFAS in that community. In a follow-up biomonitoring study, the levels did decrease, but it was recommended because the area was so contaminated that they continue to monitor drinking water in the area. And also the CDC and ATSDR is continuing their investigation of PFAS in the environment. And they're looking at expanding this work. They're working with states and communities that have already identified problematic PFAS contamination in their area, and they're providing technical assistance to them to study it further. And they are conducting further exposure assessments, and they're also partnering with academic institutions to conduct multi-site health studies that will link some of this exposure in the community to some of those health harms that I mentioned previously. And I'll just mention briefly, I think this was talked about earlier, that I think we're all aware of the problem of the substitutions or the replacements that are being used more commonly now to replace some of the different PFAS that have been phased out, like PFOA and PFOS. And what we're finding, as illustrated here in some of the national toxicology program studies, is that the health harms that we noted with the original PFAS, those same health harms are what we're seeing in these replacement chemicals, the shorter chain replacement chemicals that are being used in their place. So we are concerned about these chemicals as a class, and they should be treated so when looking at their health effects and also in regulating them. And further, the problem with these short chain replacement PFAS is that they're just as persistent in the environment, and in some cases they're actually more mobile and can travel farther distances, and they are also somewhat more difficult to treat in drinking water. So they shouldn't be viewed as a viable alternative, and they are just as problematic as the chemicals that they are replacing. So when thinking about exposure, the location that you are at can play a big part in your overall exposure to PFAS. So of course, living near a contaminated site, as I mentioned in some of the cases earlier, that could impact drinking water and be a very significant source of exposure overall. And we also know that diet can play a big role in exposure as well. If you eat a lot of prepackaged foods or things like microwave popcorn, those can also be exposures. And also things around your home can also be a route of exposure. The PFAS that come out of the products that you use in your home, for example, carpet, especially for children who spend a lot of time near the carpet and crawling around on the floor, that can be the #1 exposure route for them if you have carpet that has been treated with PFAS. And since location can play a significant role in exposure and have impacts on drinking water, we'll next take a closer look at our work that we've done to document the locations of pollution across the US. So EWG has put years of work into documenting the contaminated sites in our mapping project. And these locations include thousands of sites known to be contaminated with PFAS containing firefighting foam, industrial sites, and also sites that have reported contaminated drinking water from federal or state testing. And the more research that goes into this project, the more contamination we are uncovering, and the map only grows as we continue doing this research. So we've reviewed databases from the Environmental Protection Agency and also from a survey from the state of New York. And we found in an initial project about 2,500 sites, industrial sites that are known users of PFAS or suspected of using PFAS. And in additional work, in more recent work, we took a more detailed look at additional industry types, as well as facilities with discharge permits, including wastewater treatment plants, some additional areas of landfills and airports. And we've identified over 40,000 potential new sites that we're concerned about could be releasing PFAS into the environment. So identifying these potential sources will be key for protecting drinking water and also for supporting regulations to prevent future releases of PFAS into the environment. So we are especially concerned about these industrial sources and releases from wastewater treatment plants or airports or landfills because they can be a direct source of contamination to drinking water. So the federal government, through the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Program, did require testing of PFAS on a national scale quite a while ago now, from 2013 to 2015. But only 6 PFAS were tested, and there was some limitations to this testing program that was conducted. They had very high reporting limits. So if there was PFAS that was detected, it might not have been reported in all cases. And some of the PFAS could have been missed. And a lot of small systems were not tested during this program. And since this program was conducted, a number of states have conducted additional testing to find out more. If some initial contamination was found, states did conduct additional testing and using more sensitive detection limits. So states such as New Jersey and Michigan have since conducted a lot more thorough testing, the state of Kentucky as well. So there has been a lot more testing that has been done since this first somewhat flawed program. And what's important to note from this first initial testing is that correlations were drawn to where they found PFAS contamination and whether it was near industrial sites, airports that used the firefighting foam called AFFF, military training areas, and wastewater treatment plants. If the drinking water source was near those different sites, it was more likely to find PFAS. So it was an important to draw those conclusions that these could be potential sources of contamination. And if a source of drinking water is contaminated by wastewater or firefighting foam or an industrial source, it's a problem because typical drinking water treatment processes don't remove PFAS. You'll need to install expensive granular activated carbon or reverse osmosis systems specifically to remove PFAS. And in a recent survey by government agencies, the PFAS in an untreated water is very similar to levels in treated water. So this just demonstrates that drinking water treatment doesn't remove the PFAS from source water. And so what you're seeing, is pretty much the same levels in the finished water as in the source water. So therefore, preventing PFAS pollution in the first place will be the goal in place of installing expensive water treatment, which has had to be done in a lot of communities with contamination. Okay. And so in 2019, EWG also conducted its own survey of PFAS from drinking water samples that we collected. And we focused on metropolitan areas that served a large amount of people and took samples from 44 locations. And in PFAS were detected in over 75% of the places tested that had not previously reported PFAS in their drinking water. So these are the results of the testing in the 44 cities, with most sites being newly reported PFAS detected. And so the Environmental Protection Agency has set a non-enforceable health advisory guideline of 70 parts per trillion back in 2016. But research has shown that PFAS can impact the immune system and reproductive development at very, very small levels in the body. So in reviewing this literature, our organization recommends a much lower limit to be protective of health of about 1 part per trillion. And most of the water systems that we tested were over this limit. And this graph illustrates that multiple PFAS were detected in many of the systems, with 13 PFAS detected in one sample. So this just illustrates that there can be multiple PFAS in a drinking water sample, and we can only detect what we're testing for. And we only tested for about 30 different PFAS in the samples that we sent off to a lab. Okay. And so there are still no federal standards set for the US EPA that covers PFAS at the national scale. So the US EPA knew about pollution, about the PFAS pollution since 2001, but we still don't have a guideline. There's the health advisory guideline, but it's just been a really long and slow process trying to get a drinking water standard for these chemicals. It's been a long time coming, or it's taken a really long time to start the process, but we are now just beginning the process or the EPA is beginning the process of developing a drinking water standard for PFOA and PFAS. But this, of course, only covers those two chemicals, but not other PFAS that might be in the drinking water, as we have seen. So some states in the US have set their own limits, including New Jersey, Michigan, New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Vermont. But there are still a lot of states that do not have any limits. So that's why it would be good to have a national limit that covers the whole United States. So ultimately, what is needed is regulations that help to prevent these pollutants from being in the drinking water outright. But you can reduce exposures to PFAS if you know it's in your drinking water by using water filters. So the first step will be to contact your water provider and find out if they have treatment in place or they're doing anything to improve the drinking water that's being served to you. So individuals can use carbon filters to remove PFAS. This type of filter will need to be replaced often, and it may not be as effective for some types of PFAS, but it can be a good option. A reverse osmosis type of drinking water filter will be more effective at removing PFAS, but the drawback for this type of filter is that it is more expensive. So of course, in the big picture, in the long term, the sources of contamination should be addressed. And ultimately, this should be the responsibility of the polluter and not the community that it's falling on right now. So regulations for these chemicals have been really slow in the US, and they have included some voluntary industry phase-outs, notably of PFOA and PFAS that happened quite a while ago. But we need much stronger regulations at the federal level, given how widespread the contamination is and how many more different types of PFAS are still in use. So at the federal level, only very recently have things been happening, and some policy has been introduced to now just start to deal with the contamination. And this includes starting to develop a drinking water standard and developing guidelines to prevent the discharge of PFAS, and also to conduct additional monitoring of PFAS in drinking water. And also at the state level, a lot of states have banned PFAS in food packaging. They've banned it in cosmetics. And in California, they're also looking at a specific case of how to reduce PFAS exposure from carpets and rugs in that product category. So our organization supports several different approaches to deal with this PFAS crisis. And certainly a big part of our work is providing educational tools to make citizens aware of the issues, and providing tools like water filter guides and maps. And this awareness is very important to help push PFAS out of products in the market, such as cookware, food packaging, and furniture. So citizens' voices can be very, very powerful and necessary. And to deal with this issue, we also widely support regulations that regulate the whole class of PFAS. We can't look at them one chemical at a time, because that will be ineffective and take way too much time. And we also support taking PFAS out of products where they're just not needed. And most uses of PFAS are not necessary, and they're inessential. So we support limiting the use of PFAS as much as possible, because they're just not needed in how widespread they are used currently. So certainly there are steps that citizens can take to reduce their exposures, but overall, really in the long term, the solutions that we support, we're going to need to deal with the sources of PFAS, and the dealing with the pollution shouldn't be something that falls on a community, but it should be the responsibility of the people that make and use PFAS chemicals. And certainly for citizens, being informed about these chemicals is the first step. And so EWG also has additional resources to help reduce exposures, including a guide with a link here, and some of the items that may contain PFAS related to food or home or personal care items are listed here. And so some of the recommendations that we give are, reducing eating takeout food and cooking at home as much as possible. And in the home, we recommend avoiding anything that's labeled non-stick for cookware, and also avoiding any stain treatments or stain guard or Scotch guard on carpets and furniture. And PFAS can also be in personal care products, which you might not think about. So we recommend researching, your dental floss even, or also looking at the ingredients on cosmetics and avoiding anything that is PTFE, which is Teflon, or avoiding anything that has an ingredient that has the word fluoro in it. And so the good news is that actions do work. After PFOS and PFOA were phased out of production in the US, the levels that we see in the blood of people did begin to drop, as shown here in CDC data from the general public. Okay. And in the graph on the right, it shows how PFAS levels went down in people's blood after water filtration systems were installed in contaminated communities. So I'll conclude by saying again that because these chemicals are everywhere, we can't really avoid all of them, but we can make some changes that will make a difference. And certainly spreading awareness is a really important first step in tackling this problem. And so, but ultimately in the long term and in the bigger picture, regulations at the national level are needed to limit these chemicals and to deal with the existing contamination. And in the future, it will be best to limit the production and use of these chemicals as much as possible, since they are so harmful and so persistent. And once they are out in the environment, they're really difficult to clean up. And that concludes my presentation. And I'll just say thank you again for allowing me to present. And should I stop sharing my screen? Thank you so much.
はい。シュトイバー博士、大変分かりやすくお話をしていただきありがとうございました。一つQ&A の方で一つ質問が来ておりますので、お答えいただきたいと思います。PFAS の汚染は飲料水のみならず、空気を介して肺から汚染される、肺から広がるリスクはありますでしょうか。例えば、フッ素コートされたフライパンを空入りしたとき、防水スプレーまたは焼却炉などから吸い込んでしまう、PFAS を吸い込んでしまうというリスクはありますでしょうかというご質問です。
So I will comment that, when you're thinking about inhaling PFAS, so PFAS it can shed from a lot of the chemicals in the products in your home. For example, your carpet, furniture, textiles, things like that can contain, especially carpets, which are take up a large surface in your home. The PFAS can shed from those products, and then they can deposit into dust, and that is also, and then you can inhale the dust. So that is also one way that you're exposed in terms of indoor exposure. Inhaling from cookware, unless it's at really high temperatures, might not be as significant of a source, but certainly dust in the indoor environment can be a significant source of exposure. And as I mentioned too, for small children that is this going too long? That are close to the ground and they're in contact with a lot of household dust, that can actually be, household dust can actually be the primary exposure route for small children and toddlers. Let me know.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。他にも質問はいただいているんですけれども、大変申し訳ないんですが、今日は時間の関係で、一旦こちらで、シュトイバー博士の講演については終了とさせていただきます。シュトイバー博士、どうもありがとうございました。
Okay, thank you so much. Apologize for going over a little bit. I just saw the chat messages now about wrapping up. I think I went a little bit over, so apologies. And if you do have some follow-up questions that can be answered by email, we're happy to do that too.
ありがとうございました。はい。では今から沖縄の方、日本でもPFAS の汚染というのは進んでおります。沖縄の河村さんより、情報提供いただきたいと思います。河村さん、いらっしゃいますでしょうか。
聞こえますか？
はい、はい。ではよろしくお願いいたします。
大丈夫ですか？はい。じゃあ、始めさせていただきます。短く。はい。沖縄のインフォームドパブリックプロジェクトという団体で代表しております、河村雅美と申します。本日はダイオキシン環境ホルモン対策国民会議の皆様には、このような学びの機会を設けていただいたこと、また、環境安全基本法の制定の取り組みについて感謝申し上げます。沖縄の、PFAS の健康関係の取り組みについて、発言を依頼されましたので、ちょっとお話ししたいと思います。で、今日はちょっとお話ということで、資料は、用意してないんですけれども、一応私たちのですね、5年間やってきた、ところの、データとかの、私たちのサイトにですね、まとめているので、今、チャット欄でですね、リンクを、送りましたので、補助的にそちらの方を、参照していただきながら、お話聞いていただければと思います。で、沖縄は、2016年から、主制限が、米軍嘉手納基地により汚染されている可能性があるということが、県から発表されたことから、PFAS 汚染の問題を知ることになりました。で、この後、他のですね、普天間基地などの米軍基地周囲、それから廃棄物処分場などからも PFAS の検出が確認されて、土壌や地下水に汚染が長期的に蓄積されてきたことが分かっています。で、サイトの方の、リンクの方も見ていただけると、全体的な、概要がわかると思うんですけれども、で、普天間基地とかですね、それから自衛隊の那覇基地、先日はまた米軍の、陸軍の基地からも、漏出のですね、PFAS の漏出の事故が起きていて、問題は絶えることなく発生していて、まだちょっとこれ3月のデータなので、どんどんアップデートしなくてはならないというですね、そんな状態が沖縄は続いております。で、皆さんもご存知のように、一番深刻な問題は、飲料水で摂取する PFAS の問題で、嘉手納基地からの汚染の影響を受けている北谷浄水場は、7市町村、45万人がその水を用いています。で、PFAS が私たちの体に入り込んで蓄積されていることが分かったのは、2019年の京都大学による PFAS の血液濃度の調査でした。北谷浄水場を 100% 取水源としている宜野湾市の市民の PFAS 濃度が高かったということで、これは私たちに環境問題が健康問題であるっていうことを認識を新たにさせるものであったんですけれども、この後ですね、最初に国民会議の方の、その行政とのですね、やり取りの困難が、言及されていましたけれども、沖縄でもやはりこれをきっかけに健康調査の要望なども 市民の側から出たんですけれども、やはり行政はなかなか動きません。で、私たちはその沖縄の枯葉剤問題というのを2011年から取り組んできたんですけれども、沖縄県にですね、やはりこの頃から働きかけてきていて、沖縄県は具体的な事例が出たら検討すると当時言っていたんですけれども、これほどの具体性のあるものが出てもですね、やはりやろうとはしないという、これが現状です。ですので、東京の多摩の方たちのような、その動きがですね、やはり刺激となっておりまして、市民側でも何か動きを作れないかと考えていたんですけれども、そこで今ですね、その医師の方たち、地元の医師の方たちと連携を始めています。で、今、その地元のクリニックと連携して、ピンポイントでの疫学調査を実施してみようという、そういうパイロット的な計画を医療関係の人たちと立てています。で、代表者の医師はですね、今日出席できないので、私が協力者として代わりにお話をさせていただいているんですけれども、新型コロナウイルスの件とかですね、発言なさっている森菱沖縄臨床研修センターの徳田康治医師が中心になって、今このプロジェクトを計画しています。で、そのコロナ禍ということもあって、その京大の調査のように、その市民へ呼びかけて、来てもらってという、そういう形はできないんですけれども、そのクリニックの患者さんで、同意を得られた外来の成人患者さんの、血液を採取して、その PFAS 血中濃度と、肥満とか糖尿病とか、非アルコール性脂肪肝炎などの関連を解析するという、疫学調査を、予定していまして、現在、倫理委員会に申請中です。このような、疾病を対象とする理由っていうのは、沖縄は実はその、肥満者割合が全国一で、PFAS と、肥満の関係というのも、これまでの研究で明らかになっているので、まず、その、地元のですね、特質も踏まえて、この、実現性と、も踏まえてですね、その影響を調べることを計画しています。で、PFAS でやっぱりよく危険性を言われるのが、発がん性であったり、それから沖縄の場合、低体重児であったりするんですけれども、実はその肥満は、今、その沖縄は新型コロナウイルスで、最悪県の県で、もう10万人あたりの感染者数もぶっちぎっている状態なんですけれども、実は肥満というのが、新型コロナウイルス、COVID-19 でもですね、重症化する要因であり、その看過できない病なんですよね。で、実際にその重症化とか、その死亡化につながっている例というのも、臨床医から聞いて、深刻な問題であるということも聞いております。で、沖縄ではその肥満などは、沖縄の生活習慣によるものと考えられがちなんですけれども、PFAS のような化学物質を原因とするものであるという可能性も見据えていく必要もあるんではないかということもあって、そのきっかけとなる調査にできたらいいなと思っています。で、ダイオキシンの問題でも、その専門家からですね、その分かりやすい毒性のみが表面化した疾病だけでなくて、多くはその原因不明で、個人的な体質による疾患として、潜在化されているものがあるのではないかっていう、問いがあるんですけれども、同じように PFAS の問題も、そういうものもある可能性もあるのではないかっていうですね、そういうことも考えながら、結果がどう出るかはわかりませんけれども、一つそういう意識をですね、啓発することも含めて、取り組んでいきたいと思っています。それで、先ほど、講演でも触れられていたんですけれども、ワクチンに対するですね、抗体反応の低下という、そういう懸念も、その PFAS の影響ではあるので、沖縄ではですね、その脆弱性の問題も含めて、今また考えて、この、調査とともにですね、考えていきたいと思っています。で、医師たちは、これらの解析をもとに、 その暴露を最小限にするための政策介入を行うように自治体などへの働きかけを行っていったり、将来的にはコホート研究を行う、そのきっかけとしていきたいと言っておりました。また、社会的な面から言えば、その地元の医療者が、その地元の市民と関わりながら実施していくということで、そのコミュニティへの啓発的な部分というのも、その考慮に入れながらですね、そういう効果も含めて、またそれからその他のクリニックとかですね、その様々な領域からのアプローチも広げられるきっかけになれるような、そういうそのパイロット的な動きにできたらなということで、今そういうことを計画しています。ということで、まだその始めたばかりでどうなるかわからないものなんですけれども、ちょっと報告として場を与えられたので、これで報告いたしました。ということで、私の方からの報告は終わります。ありがとうございました。
川本さん、どうもありがとうございました。
はい、ありがとうございます。
はい、当初ちょっとここで一旦休憩ということを予定していたんですけれども、時間が押している関係で、一斉の休憩は取らずに、中下の方より環境安全基本法についてご説明をさせていただきたいと思います。